the dictionary definition of performance is that it generally, Webster says high performance means being better, faster, or more efficient than others. And I think that that's such a short-sighted
Mm,
view of performance that it's all in comparison to what somebody else is doing. So as long as I'm doing more than you are, I'm a higher performer. As long as I'm a little better than you are, I'm a higher performer. And
mm,
ultimately, I think that's just a really low bar for ourselves and for the companies that we lead, especially if you're working in a space where you're trying to make innovative breakthroughs, you're trying to lead the market, or you're trying to deliver something really outstanding for your customers. Holding yourself and your understanding of high performance in terms of comparison to what other people are doing, it's just a really low bar. And there's another definition that I think is a lot more useful. And this one comes from Marcus Buckingham, and he has a book called The One Thing You Need to Know. And in his book, he says that high performance, or he calls it peak performance, is about making the greatest possible impact over the longest possible time.
mm,
And I really love that definition because it helps us to reframe that performance is about our outcomes, the real impact of our work, and how we can sustain that, versus just how much we can produce and how much output we can create. It gets us focused on the impact and the outcome of our work, which I think is much more powerful, and it's much more freeing because it opens up a whole lot more to understand about what we can do and what it takes to have that kind of peak long-lasting performance.
mm. Yeah, the way that that was read, I could see potentially misunderstanding that to some degree, to say that like it the goal should be to make the biggest impact regardless of how long it takes. But
Mm,
what he's saying is more of like to have the biggest impact that continues to be impactful over the longest period of time. So
mhm.
instead of just being like a one-hit wonder, so to
Yep.
speak, right, to continue to make the impact you want to make, even perhaps after you're gone or your organization is moved on, with different leadership or whatever the case may be, right?
Mhm. So here's another way to think about it. When I was working on writing my book, I started out writing, and I talked to a lot of authors around how they've written their books. And I know you've written some books too. So I'd be curious what your thoughts here are on this. But one of the pieces of advice I got over and over again was to make sure to set aside time for writing, to build a writing habit and to write regularly. So I did. I like carved out time in my calendar to write a couple of hours every day, and things were going swimmingly well, except that I had just gotten started in early 2020, and then the pandemic hit and unfolded, and everything about life just kind of turned upside down. And I continued trying to make progress on this writing habit. So I spent 90 minutes every day writing. But what I was finding was I was making almost zero progress on my book.
Mm,
Even though that time had, set aside my calendar and it was one of my top five priorities, to work on, I wasn't making any progress on it. And what I realized over some time was that building a writing habit and writing every day wasn't actually my goal at all. I didn't actually care about the writing habit that I developed. My goal was to get this book written, this book about how well-being and high performance go hand in hand, and we need to shift the way we think about our work to stop burnout, right? My goal is to get that book written. And I started to realize that writing every day wasn't going to get me there. And so I really had to reframe my outcome and my goal. And what I wound up doing was doing weekend long writing retreats about every 6 weeks. I took a long
mm,
weekend and I would write for 4 days. And then I wouldn't touch my book in between that time because I
mm,
couldn't get my brain into it and do all the other things that I had to do. So I started to measure my writing progress, not by how much I was writing, not by how many words I was writing, but I started measuring it by, I had my big goal, but then I had each chapter, and I had my
mm-hmm,
interviews, and I had my edits, and I sliced that down into these smaller micro goals that I could track. And that's ultimately how I determined how productive I was being and my performance. And then ultimately, even just getting the book published wasn't my real goal. It was like, what happens after somebody reads it and what kind of impact does it have? But that shift for me was really important because it shifted my own sense of what does it mean to be a good writer? What does it mean to be dedicated to my work? And recognizing that I really didn't care, and it really didn't matter how many words I was writing a day. That was a really false metric of
mm.
productivity and progress.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I think the daily writing habit is if you just really want to be a good writer, quote
Mhm,
unquote. Like you really want to develop writing skills, but not necessarily if you want to produce a book of value.
mhm.
You know,
Yep.
I'm with you. I find it much more helpful to have longer periods of deep work. Like for me, 90 minutes is like right when I'm getting into flow. And so
Mhm.
that's right when the best stuff starts happening. And I really wouldn't want to just kind of break right there. So
That's
I
exactly what I
agree.
found too, right? I actually needed like a day to get into flow, and then I could get so much done in the like 8 to 10 hours that I really had in those, weekend getaways. So much more done in those 8 to 10 hours in a long weekend day than 8 to 10 hours spread out over a week.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't equivalent. It's same amount of time, even the same amount of time on my calendar, but it wasn't the same amount of time at all because of what I could actually get done during that time and how I was able to engage and get into that flow state while I was writing.